So let's assume that we have an employee class. Now, an employee class essentially is the definition or template or blueprint for potential objects which could be made. Now, in the employee class, let's make some instance variables. We could have a string which sort of keeps track of their CEO, perhaps. And we could also have a integer variable which keeps track of their employee ID. Now, of course, these object references will be created in the main method. So let's actually make a main method, public static void main, and then string args. In the main method, we can actually create objects which draw from this class. Let's create two employees. One can be called Naveen, and we're going to call the default constructor, which is implicit. And we're also going to call Josh, or we're going to create a reference called Josh, which too refers to the default constructor, which is again implicit. So essentially, I could, for Naveen, I could essentially assign employee ID a value. I could say his ID is 5, and his CEO, or Naveen.CEO, could be, let's say, Mahesh. I'd essentially do the same thing for Josh, that is using his name and then referring to the instance variable that I want to access. And since they both work for the same company, his CEO will also be Mahesh. I can also create a method inside the employee class, and this method can be public. I'm not going to return anything. It's going to be responsible for showing me the initialized values. So in the show method, what it's going to do is it's going to print out the employee ID. And it's also going to print out the CEO. So I can actually call josh.show, and I can call naveen.show, and it should show me their particulars. Now, of course, they both have the same CEO and different IDs. Now, given that they both have the same CEO, why don't we just go ahead and make the CEO static? In other words, declaring this static here will allow us to essentially, for any object that we create, CEO will always be the same. That is, if I declared CEO as Mahesh here, and I didn't have these variables, which is sort of initialize their CEO, this implies that for every object I create, they're all going to have a CEO called Mahesh. So if I were to print this out again, they both have a CEO called Mahesh. Now, of course, with employee ID, we would have a constructor, right? So it would be employee, which would set the default values. So for employee ID, I could just set this as 0 for a default value. And for the CEO, I could set this as an empty string. However, it doesn't make sense to have a static variable, which is the same for each and every object, in a constructor. This is going to set the default value when I know that every single CEO will be called Mahesh. So it doesn't make too much sense using a constructor. A constructor, whenever the employee constructor is called, it's going to set default values. It's going to create a new value for the CEO. However, I want the CEO to be a fixed value for each and every object created. So it's not object specific. Every object I create, that is every employee of the employee class, will essentially have the CEO as Mahesh. So I could do this for EID, for the employee ID, but can I do this for the static variable? No. What I could do instead, or really to initialize CEO, I could do it in the first line here, but usually more commonly what is done is, or more properly at least, we can just simply use a static block and then declare the CEO as Mahesh in the confines of a static field block. And again, that sort of reaches the same conclusion. That is to say, they both have the same CEO. And of course, I could change this, right? I could say Sarah, and this would of course reap Sarah in that case. So that really is sort of the basics of static variables.